In the spring semester, I had a chance to teach a class at Ozark Christian College called Theology, Technology, and Digital Culture. And it's a class that's related to some of the doctoral work that I'm doing on the philosophy and theology of digital technology. It was, of course, an unusual time to be teaching a college class just in general, but especially a class on digital technology as we began our semester in face-to-face class. And then, of course, we ended the semester just like everyone else in distance learning online. And so I was asked to present to the faculty recently some of the lessons that I learned in preparing for and teaching this class. And I decided to make this more broadly available because I think it'll be helpful to all of us as we sort of grapple with or reflect on the influence of digital technology in our lives during this really unique season. So I hope that you find this helpful. The first lesson, I'm going to give you 3 lessons that I learned in teaching this class. And the first lesson that I learned is that the world is changing and digital technology is in the driver's seat. None of us need to spend too much time reflecting on the fact that the world is changing. We obviously, of course, know that that's the case. The world is changing. What we're not necessarily reflecting on as much as maybe we should is that digital technology is in the driver's seat of this change. Here's just a few statistics that I came across in doing my research. There's, of course, a lot more statistics and data that we could throw out there. But teenagers use screen media an average of 7 hours and 22 minutes every day, while they read for only 29 minutes per day. 56% of teens associate the absence of their cell phone with at least one of these 3 emotions: loneliness, being upset, or feeling anxious. Additionally, girls are much more likely than boys to feel anxious or lonely without their cell phone. In 2018, for the first time, teens valued face-to-face communication less than other forms of communication. Now, these are some of the most up-to-date statistics and data that I was able to find, but one thing that I think we all realize is this data is now incredibly outdated because our relationship with digital technology in the last 4 or 5 months has been sent into hyperdrive. And the one thing that I've been saying to our faculty and to anyone else is that it's really difficult to predict how COVID will change students' relationship with screens. Anybody that tells you that they know exactly how things are changing right now is just deluding themselves. We know that things are changing. There's no doubt that things are changing. There's no doubt that things will look different on the other side of this pandemic than when we started this season. But we don't really know exactly how, especially students, the people that I do my work with, we don't exactly know how their relationship with screens is going to change. Will there be a response against screens? So in other words, once this pandemic is over, will students, will their daily use of screens actually start to go down as they sort of revolt against their experience over these last several months? I suppose that's a possibility. I suppose that's a hopeful possibility that students will start to, want to engage people in a more personal way because of just the struggle that they've had over the last months of engaging just through a screen. In higher education, one of the things that we're keeping our eye on is how will students regard online education in the future? Will they lean into online education because of the experience that they've had, or will they intentionally choose to avoid online education in the future because of this negative experience? No one really knows for sure. But I think it is worth noting that things are certainly going to change and are changing. Many associate the birth of Gen Z, which is the current kind of generation that's in college, with a tech revolution. Jean Twenge, in her really important book on iGen, what some people call Gen Z, she links the birth of Gen Z with the advent of Windows 95. Because Windows 95, if some of you can remember back that far, Windows 95 was the first operating system that made access to the internet ubiquitous. if you had a PC, you now had the ability to go online. And that was the first time that happened. So this generation can't really recall a time in their lives without digital technology, without internet technology. And this generation has been shaped by that presence. It's been shaped by that reality. So the question that we have to ask is, are we now going to witness the birth of a new generation? Will students look different, or how will they look different on the other side of COVID, especially in regard to digital technology? Another question that I'm asking is, are we also witnessing the birth of a new, more technocratic civilization? And for this, I want to pull in some quotes from a couple French philosophers that I uncovered in my research. So Jacques Ellul was a French philosopher who was writing around the middle of the 20th century. And one of his most important books, he reflects on what he calls technique. And technique, to Ellul, was basically a worldview. It was a worldview governed by the principles of efficiency and control. Technique was a worldview characteristic of a technological society, that a technological society will eventually become governed by the potential and the presence of its technology. So he says the power and autonomy of technique are so well secured that it in its turn has become the judge of what is moral, the creator of a new morality. Thus, it plays the role in the creator of a new civilization as well. Technology, to Ellul, opens up all these new opportunities, right? All these new potentialities. But technology also has a way of limiting our options, creating new imperatives that didn't exist before, and thus creating a new civilization around this presence of technology. Jacques Maritain says something similar. He says technology is good as a means for the human spirit and for human ends. I would agree with that. But technocracy, that is to say, technology so understood and so worshipped as to exclude any superior wisdom and any other understanding than that of calculable phenomena, leaves in human life nothing but relationships of force, or at best those of pleasure, and necessarily ends up in a philosophy of domination. A technocratic society is but a totalitarian one. What he's saying there is that technology has this tendency to become the center of our, not just of our lives, but to become the center of our civilization, and to create a new civilization in its image. Now, what does this have to do with our current moment? Well, I think to some degree or another, I think that our experience of this pandemic has been a very technocratic type of experience. So let me just illustrate it this way. If digital technology didn't exist, it would be much more difficult to tell churches, for instance, you're going to have to close your doors for the next 4, 5, 6 months. If digital technology didn't exist, it would be much more difficult to tell schools, hey, you're going to have to send students home, and you're not going to be able to educate students at all for the foreseeable future. If digital technology didn't exist, it would be much more difficult to tell businesses, corporations, send all of your people home. They're not able to come into work, and you have to be shut down for the foreseeable future. But because digital technology exists, now it becomes a new imperative. Yes, we must shut down schools and just go online. We must shut down churches and just go online. We must shut down our business offices and just go online. The just go online refrain is a technocratic refrain. So technology has given us these great new opportunities, but it's also reshaping the very fabric of our civilization. Now, guys like Ellul and Maritain, to a lesser extent, were we're criticized for being too fatalistic and too negative about technology. We need to be careful about that. We need to be careful about becoming too negative in our assessment. There are some wonderful things that technology has been able to do for us, that we've been able to do with our technology, especially during this very unique season. But I think we also need to hear the warning. We need to hear the warning. Have we allowed digital technology to reshape for us in some irreversible ways, to reshape for us what relationships look like, what worship looks like, what education looks like, and just go down the list? What I see happening is I see us taking our cues from technology. So we make decisions based on what technology makes available to us. That's what Elul is getting at when he says that technology is the judge of what's moral, the creator of a new morality. So it is now immoral to meet as a church because the technology exists to where you don't have to be in the same building together at the same time. So that technology has created a new imperative, it's created a new morality, and it's in the process creating a new civilization. And I think that we need to hear these warnings well. And again, it's impossible to predict what exactly are we going to look like, what are students going to look like on the other side of this. But I think we need to be thoughtful about keeping technology in its place and not being so willing to allow technology to reshape what it means to be human. The second lesson that I learned in teaching this class is that our discipleship must really account for digital technology. A really helpful book that I read last year was written by David Kinnaman, put out by Barna Research. It's called Faith for Exiles. And I strongly recommend this book to anyone, but especially if you are working or ministering to college age, high school age students. The book really is about how to create resilient disciples in a time where following Jesus has always required resiliency. It's always required perseverance and endurance. But especially in these times, following Jesus is just going to require grit. It's going to require resilience during this season of what Kinnaman calls a season of exile for the church. And so the book is punctuated by all sorts of research and data where they did research on really 4 groups of young people. The first group they call prodigals or ex-Christians. These are people who maybe they grew up in the church, but now they don't have anything to do with the church. There's also a second group called nomads or unchurched. And these people would be, they wouldn't necessarily characterize themselves as non-Christian. They may even go to church from time to time. If they go home and visit their parents or they go and visit their grandparents, they might come to church. But they would really be characterized as unchurched people. They have no relationship with the church or no perceivable relationship with Jesus. Then there's a third group called habitual churchgoers, and these are people who would self-identify as Christians. And they may go to church as much as maybe once a month or so, but they're not necessarily committed or growing in their discipleship in any observable ways. And then the fourth group is resilient disciples. And so they wanted in the book, they wanted to track or identify what are those characteristics that set resilient disciples apart from some of these other groups. And one of the questions that really struck me in reading the book was this question here. Did you regularly experience help with living wisely when it comes to technology in your church, parish, or faith community? And you'll notice that both for habitual churchgoers, but especially for resilient disciples, overwhelmingly they said yes. Someone cared enough. Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a youth minister, a D group leader, whatever the case may be, but somebody cared enough to talk to me about living with technology. Those who had fallen away from the church or who had very limited relationship with the church, they had the opposite experience. I never heard anyone talk about living wisely or virtuously with technology. And so to me, when I look at these numbers, I'm seeing a huge opportunity. I'm seeing a huge imperative for the church. Like our discipleship strategies, especially nowadays, they simply must include instructions and thoughtful reflections on digital technology and faith. So that leads me to ask this question then. What is our digital responsibility to those we lead? What responsibility do we have? Well, I think the first thing that we need to come to grips with is this point here. The digital is not merely on your phone. I don't know how many times I've heard people complain, and I've been one of them, to be honest. Oh, these kids these days, they're just always on their phone. By the way, we are on our phones too. Everyone is on their phone. But we hear that common refrain, that common complaint, right? Oh, they're just on their phone nonstop. Well, I think that it would be helpful to start thinking of the phone as a space. The digital has become a space. They're not simply on their phone, they're in a space. So think about it this way. Online spaces have become third places to most young people. Now, what's a third place? Well, a third place is a place that's not your home, and it's not your place of work or your school. Your home is your first place, work and school is your second place. A third place is a place of social gathering. Maybe it's a coffee shop, maybe it's a restaurant or bar, maybe it's a park. That's a third place. It's a place of social gathering, consistent social gathering that's not your home, and it's not your work or your school. So before the pandemic, digital spaces for most young people were third places. It was the place where they congregated. It was the place of social interaction. Now, what's happened during the pandemic? You can't go to school. You can't go to the coffee shop. You can't go to church. You can't go to any of those places. You can't go to work. So the phone, the virtual, has become the second place during the pandemic. And to me, if I'm thinking about strategies for discipleship, if I neglect the third place, but especially if I neglect the second place in a student's life, I'm really doing them a grave disservice in training them up to follow Jesus. Heidi Campbell, who's written several books on faith and digital technology, she says that any space where we think our faith is irrelevant, we come to think that God is no longer present in those locations and thus remove any aspect of the sacred from them. Now, she's saying something important there. If I don't think that my faith is relevant in a place, then God is no longer present in that place. That place is no longer sacred. And I've created this rift in my experience where I have some places where God is and some other places where God is not. And so if we see the digital space as a space, we've got to help, especially young people, we've got to help them to see or to recognize that God is just as present in that space as he is present in any other space. Here's another quote from an author named John Dyer. He says, when technology has distracted us to the point that we no longer examine it, it gains the greatest opportunity to enslave us. And so at Ozark, we talk a lot about being culturally agile, being able to navigate this culture and being able to navigate the culture in such a way that we can bring glory to God and also bring the gospel to all people. So culturally agile in this sense means recognizing and critiquing the values of digital spaces from a biblical worldview. So I don't want to tell my students, hey, just get off your phone. I don't want to tell them, hey, social media, it's evil. You need to have nothing to do with it. On the other hand, I also don't want to just take digital technology for granted and not even think about it and just kind of lean into it without any sort of critical reflection. No, I think if we're going to reflect on our digital responsibility to those we lead, we've got to clearly articulate and get them to think through what does it mean for me to be a disciple of Jesus who is using digital technology and occupying digital spaces? I want them to think about it. In the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians, taking every thought captive in this day and age means that I don't just give a passing glance to digital technology. I actually lean into it. I think about it. I reflect on it. I ruminate it. I pray about it. And in doing so, I strip it of some of its power. Those things that we think about, those things that we critically analyze and ruminate on and pray about, are also those things that we bring under the lordship of Christ. And so I believe that as leaders, as educators, as youth ministers, as parents, we need to be having regular, intentional conversations where we don't just shame students about the time that they spend online, but we actually get them to think about it from a digital or from a biblical worldview. We ask questions like this. How is your time on Facebook shaping you as a disciple of Jesus? How is your time watching Netflix? Is that helping you follow Jesus better? Is it hurting you in some ways? How is it reshaping the way that you live your life? Just asking those questions, getting us to think through those questions, I think is a great, it's not just a great help to us. I think it's an imperative right now, especially as we move beyond the pandemic, to continue to ask those sorts of challenging questions. So here's the third lesson that I learned. And it's more specific to our experience at Ozark, because at Ozark, our goal, our mission is to train men and women for Christian service. We're a ministry training school. And so as I think about ministry training, both now and in the future, we've got to go beyond mere competent use of digital technology. So ministry training has to be more than just showing students how to use technology. We've also got to help students to think about technology. So when it comes to kind of the philosophy of technology, there are really two schools of thought. The one school of thought, kind of represented by the Jacques Ellul's of the world, is sometimes called determinism. And determinism says that technology is never neutral, that technology, it changes you. It shapes you into its image. Okay, so the minute that you adopt a certain technology, that technology can't help but change you as its user. And there's all sorts of different examples that you could use of this. Think about one of the most basic technologies that exists. Think about a hammer. A hammer isn't neutral because a hammer changes you. It changes what you're capable of. It changes what it looks like to build a structure. A hammer gives you different possibilities, but it also gives you different limitations as well. Think about a car. A car isn't neutral. A car changes your experience of being human. All of a sudden, spaces look different if you have a car. Time looks different if you have a car. You could literally do this exercise for any piece of technology. Technology isn't neutral. The minute that you use a technology, it changes your experience. It changes your assumptions. It changes what you value. That's the determinist school of thought, that technology is never neutral. On the other hand, you have a utilitarian perspective that says technology is merely a tool. That hammer, it's just a tool for pounding in nails. That car, it's just a tool for getting you from point A to point B. That's all it is. So you could use a tool in virtuous ways, you could use a tool in non-virtuous ways, but a utilitarian says, no, technology is under our power. It's under our usage. And so you can see how these schools of thought kind of oppose each other or come into conflict with each other. A determinist says that our technology affects us. Utilitarians say that we use our technology to affect the world. Nowadays, there's a significant overlap between the two where people are looking at both of these perspectives and saying, well, maybe they both are making valid points. And that's kind of where I am. I've come to see technology as a ratchet. So you think about a ratchet as a tool. A ratchet it allows you to move forward, but it doesn't allow you to move backward. Okay, so you can use a ratchet as a tool moving forward, but a ratchet is also going to limit your ability to go backwards. That's how a ratchet works. And so I think technology works in the same way. I think there is a utilitarian purpose of technology. That technology gives us the ability to do things that we wouldn't otherwise have the ability to do. But it also is deterministic insofar as soon as you adopt that technology, it's going to have a limiting factor. It's going to make some things available to you and some things unavailable to you. That's just the nature of technology. So when I asked my students this question in class, does digital technology bring about a positive or negative effect? I asked them this question at the end of the course. And I asked them kind of in two directions. First of all, do you believe that digital technology positively or negatively affects personal discipleship? And then, because these are ministry training students, do you believe that digital technology positively or negatively affects the church's mission? And you see the difference in responses. When it comes to discipleship, personal discipleship, my students were much more pessimistic about its effect. So my students, when it comes to discipleship, they were kind of in the determinist camp. That, yeah, you use social media, you get addicted to social media, it's going to have a negative effect on you. It's going to, your smartphone, it's going to change the nature of your relationships. It's going to change even the nature of your relationship with God. And so the students were much more pessimistic about the influence of technology when it comes to personal discipleship. They kept on using phrases like technology hinders my ability to be fully present. So I can't fully be present with others. I can't fully be present with God. It's a constant distraction. So, when it comes to personal discipleship, there was wide agreement in the class that technology reshapes us in some ways that are, pretty negative. But when it comes to ministry, the responses were much more optimistic. So in ministry, they believe that technology has a positive effect. And, I'm not even sure that, I think that they make a valid point in this. The church has always used technology to advance the gospel to more people. You go all the way back to the book of Acts, Paul using the Roman road system, the Roman mail carrier system. Paul uses these technologies in his day to great effect to expand his ministry beyond the wildest dreams of a person who just lived a generation or two before him. So Paul wasn't bashful about using technology in that way. And you look through the history of the church, whether it's the printing press or even in more modern times, radio, television. I found this great quote from a Christian magazine in the 1970s, where in this magazine it said, "I can't imagine a person building a church building nowadays and not allowing space for a radio tower in the chancel of the church. I can't imagine a church not including the opportunity for a radio broadcast." Now, we kind of laugh about that today. But think about it. If you're starting a church today, how many would say the exact same things about having an online service? I can't imagine starting a church today and not having the ability to go live on the internet every Sunday morning, or do a significant amount of their discipleship online. I mean, that's just become sort of our new way of thinking, right? So, and I don't imagine all these churches that are doing online services now for the last several months, do you really think that they're going to stop doing online ministry once this pandemic is over? No, of course not. And I don't think they probably should. I think there's been a new door of opportunity open for us here for the gospel, and churches are going to walk through that door of opportunity. And so when it comes to ministry, my students are much more utilitarian, and I think they make some valid points. But what I didn't see a lot of reflection on was, okay, if we adopt this technology in our personal discipleship and we recognize that it might have a negative effect, might digital technology also have a negative effect on our mission and our ministry as well? In other words, how does watching a service online, and it is very much watching a service online, very little participation in that service, how does watching a service online potentially affect us in very negative ways as disciples and also as a community? These are the types of questions that we really need to be asking. So, are we witnessing the ratcheting effect of technology in our lives? Well, I think clearly we are. This is a quote from the governor of Kansas, Governor Laura Kelly. She was receiving some major pushback on her policies regarding the closing of church buildings in the pandemic. And this was her response. She said, religion is really not about the building. It's about the faith. It's about how it feels on the inside. The need to congregate is important, but not during a pandemic. I'm not trying to suppress religion. I'm just trying to save Kansans' lives. Now, I don't want to be too hard on the governor. I think she's coming from a good place. Yes, we want to try to get the pandemic under control. We want to save as many lives as possible. What I find troubling, though, is the first part of her statement. Religion isn't about the building. It's about faith. It's about how it feels on the inside. Congregating is important, but maybe not as important now during a pandemic. How many Christians reading this quote would absolutely nod in agreement? Well, yeah, it's not really about the building, right? The church isn't the building, it's the people. And faith is about how it feels on the inside. I don't need to be around other people. Faith is a private, personal experience that I get to have. And so here you have a redefinition of what faith really is all about, and this redefinition is provided for us by the presence of technology. Just go online. It's not a big deal. You don't need to be in a building together. Just go online. You could have the same experience, maybe even a better experience online than in a building. And I'm really troubled by the way that we are redefining things like religion and faith in this digital age. Ministry training in the age of COVID should involve training in the competent use of technology. It should most definitely include that. But it also has to include robust training on ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the nature of the church. What is the church really about? Is Governor Kelly correct that the church doesn't really need to congregate together in order to be a church? Is it really true that faith is about how it feels on the inside? Is that why the church exists? Does the church exist to give individuals sort of personal and private experiences of the divine? Is that why the church exists? So we should include a robust training in ecclesiology, in missiology. How do we accomplish our mission in the earth? How does technology, digital technology, enhance that mission? But also, how does digital technology on occasion get in the way of that mission? And also biblical anthropology. What is the nature of humankind? And how does digital technology give us great opportunities and great new potentialities, but also how does digital technology reshape us in its own image? So this is my last question. Do our values shape the way that we use technology, or does technology reshape our values? I think that's the formative question that we always have to be asking. Do we use technology out of our values, or does technology reshape our values, our priorities, our beliefs?